Hello, hello, hello. My name is Alexander Speaks, and welcome to a Grimoire Ramble. If this is your first one, it's where I pull up my Grimoire and I ramble. And you may want to pull out your Grimoire, a sketchbook, a journal, a diary, some household chores, or anything really that you, my bestie, wants company while working on. Please feel free to pull out yourself a cup of cool water because I know I never get enough water myself. These rambles are typically on the cuff and full of imperfections for the imperfect artist. And with that out of the way, let me tell you what I'm working on and what I'll be rambling about. In my grimoire today, I'll be working on a Neptunian planetary magic spread with music-based symbology. And today I'll be rambling about In Defense of Suffering, Consuming Media and Life, Personal Anecdotes of Bad Art, an oracle reading, and more. And with that out of the way, let's get started. For today's special Grimoire Ramble episode, I am placing a viewer discretion is advised. With the topic of In Defense of Suffering, we have to talk about some things, and to talk about those things requires some level of both nuance and defense of it, and when not defend it, but also accuracy in description of it. This language that we will be using and the examples that will be given, they're not meant and they're not intended to harm you. They are also not intended for you to use them as an excuse, as a reasoning tool, as a way of explaining why you do deserve to suffer, why you should harm yourself. That is not the point whatsoever. So if you clicked on this thinking that we are going to be talking about some graphic topics and why you actually are a terrible person and you should not be happy, we will not be discussing that. So if you're ready for having a mature discussion, viewer discretion is advised. As the great 21st century philosopher Kesha Rose once said, "Love comes with pain. I don't know why." Recently, I've been engaging with mediums and materials that I personally find uncomfortable and that I don't particularly enjoy. This is different. This is separate from the element of doom scrolling, right? So, doom scrolling, as you probably all aware, but just in case you are unfamiliar with the term, it's saying like, this is all the things that are going wrong with the world, there is a genocide, or rather several genocides going across the world that you, as someone who pays taxes in your country, are help actually funding to pay for. Theoretically, at some extension, the clothes you're wearing, they're made from slave labor from children. The world is on fire and you are going to die. And the application of doom scrolling is the consistent need to consistently keep up to date. And this is different from the obvious, well understanding notion that the news directly affects you and you have to be more aware. This is more of a compulsive need to physically scroll and continue scrolling because you are stuck in that cataclysmic form of, in some ways, people describe it as self-harm. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm specifically talking about is watching movies and reading books and engaging in video games and dialogues and conversations that I don't agree with, I don't like, I don't enjoy. And why would I do that? Well, part of the method to the madness, I guess you could say, is a bit of exposure. I particularly and personally believe that sometimes bad stuff will be right sometimes. There's that saying that a broken clock is right twice a day. And that's what I'm really looking for. I'm thinking about the very next Grimoire Ramble that I want to do because I'd recorded like several of these and then I realized that I actually wanted to not talk about these stuff anymore. I wanted to delete the rambles I've already done, and then I wanted it to feel more current, So I'm forming my thoughts on the next Grimoire Ramble I wanted to do, which was it's going to be a video response to Tom Benjamin in his discussion of the ego and using cultural and verbal symbology to basically have conversations with ourselves and others, right? Of like, oh, well, this is what the ego means for me, da 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 da. But that's besides the point. One of the notions in that video that I'm gearing up and preparing for to talk about is compartmentalizing yourself, and specifically the things that I'm trying to do to find different elements of myself outside of myself. So that sounds a very roundabout way of saying that I want witchcraft books and I want witchcraft decks. I want tarot decks and oracle decks and runes and Lenormand. I want playing card decks. I want all of this, right? And I want all of it from all these different points of view. And one of them happens to be I want to include gay witchcraft. That is witchcraft that is specifically created and coined and comes from the point of view of someone who has, even though I don't identify as, identify as the word queer, would identify as like an analogous situation to me. So I'm reading this book and I don't like it. I do not like it. I do not like it so much that it's almost like I'm interested in talking more about it and saying why I do not like this book. And it's through this search of I don't like this, and I don't like this, and I don't like this consistent suffering through the entire book that made me really come up with this idea of like in defense of suffering. Why would I, or why would you want to look at bad art, bad in air quotes, and what would you have to say about it? That's the main point, or at least the main starting point. For me, I feel like it's a bit about approaching art with sincerity. So one of my personal pet peeves and one of my personal beliefs is that everyone is like, I want to write a book, I want to write a book, I want to write a book. And in reality, I personally do not believe that writing a book is hard. Now hear me out. I think the issue is, and here's the discerning nuance factor, is that a lot of people have this experience of like reading books a lot growing up, and they would just tear through the book and they're like, this book was good and this book was good. And then when you get to an adult and you're like, oh, I want to have the same experience of these people who have curated a set of really good intellectual books for me to read, but you're not really having that curated experience. You find all these books on the shelves and you open it and you're like, this isn't good, right? Objectively, this is trash. And it feels harsh to say that, but there is something to say that not all art, not all books have the same value and merit, you know? The Metamorphosis by Kafka has, to me at least, more meaning and more merit than a book entirely quote unquote written by generative AI. So the exercise of looking at bad art becomes less of like, I'm trying to replicate this identity of who I was as a child reading all these books, and more of, I'm reading this book about gay witchcraft. I don't like it. I want to discuss why I don't like it. I want to have a solid form, a reasoning, an understanding of why it is quote unquote bad, and then use the bad that I've gathered from this, that I've gleaned from this, and see what can I get from this. A recent example of like this logic is that I remember listening to this video by Molly Roberts talking about what are we so tired from? Why are we so exhausted? And she used this phrase that, on the surface, it's understandable, but it's one of those things where you don't understand it until it fully clicks your mind. From lived experience, where she says that maybe what we are recovering from and exhausted from is social engagements of poor quality. And for people who, at least in my part of the world, they do feel very lonely. They do feel very lonely. They wish there was a sense of connection with their community. They may grasp at straws for any engagement with other people. And it was only until I had a very, let's be honest, poor quality interaction with people that I personally thought I had expectations, which you know what they say. They say expectations are future resentments. But it was only afterwards where I went, you know what? I was here for a good 4 to 5 hours, being very respectful, very kind. This is not for me. And it sucked. It was not good. It was not nice. But I realized afterwards a lot of things. I realized that my desire for community was ill placed, right? That's not to say like it was wrong for me to want community, but more of I wanted community and I was looking in all the wrong ways, in all the wrong for all the wrong reasons, in the wrong places with the wrong people. It's more about the realization and saying, well, this did not go well. What can we learn about it? And that's not to say that like I am defending pointless suffering. I'm not saying you need to put yourselves in uncomfortable, painful situations. And I hope that's clear. It's more of that I'm just saying, like, how dare I dream that of all the worldly pleasures and all the worldly joys, that I could be foolish enough to believe that anything ever good could ever be found in a moment of being uncomfortable. You know? I personally believe that we're at a time where a lot of quote unquote content and media, it's being produced relatively at a very fast pace. And it's gotten to the point in where people's desire to consume media is outpacing people's attempts to create it. And people's attempt to create it goes back to my point about, writing isn't that hard, because people are just writing books left and right with the very first point of view thought that they had. When I say I like bad art, what I mean is I like bad art, and I like bad art that is thought out, that is explanatory from a perspective, from a point of view. For me, the contrast between highbrow and lowbrow art is honestly just intent, it's execution. It's not, well, this person did classical art, they did classical music, and this person did hip hop. That's not how it works for me. For me, I think that there's beauty and there's wisdom and there's deepness in story that you can get, for example, in the metamorphosis of Kafka, than you could from a video game like Bloodborne. Or maybe some of the stories that you personally don't like. I'm specifically thinking about some books, some stories, some basically, I don't know how you would even explain it, but different things that people particularly don't like. And yet some people are capable of engaging with it and giving very specific artistic critiques of it. And then some people are only capable of fully writing it off. I remember at one point I was working at a bookstore, and my experience working at this bookstore was less than desirable. There was this girl that was working there, and we were speaking at one point in time, and she basically was saying that she was studying this word, this term, and I didn't know what that word was. So I asked her, what does this word mean? And she said, it's basically when you study your own point of view, your own perspective, and see where other people would poke holes in it so you could preemptively build a defense for it. And I think that really goes back to the point of view of not having people not really being able to engage with ideas, with art that they don't understand with. They don't understand. It's not something that they immediately grasp. In the same way that I want to give myself the pleasure and joy of slowly mulling over a book, I also want to slowly and with discernment go over the same stuff, the things that I don't like. And I want to understand to the same level of depth, why do I not like this? In some ways, it's as simple as comparing and contrasting. With the media that I like, that I enjoy, I'm comparing myself to it. I am saying, I really like this artist and I like how they do this thing and this thing and this thing. But without comparison to pull yourself against it, you're working without a reflection. And I think you're entitled to that. I think you're entitled to suffer. I think you're entitled to not like things. You are allowed to not like people. You are allowed to not like music. You are allowed to not like books or works of art. But I want to ask of you, if you do not like something, can you give a reason for it? Can you try to discern a reason for it? Can you find a solid footing for that reason? And I think that your displeasure in media is almost a right. You are allowed to not enjoy things. You are allowed to say, I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong. I don't like the argument here. I think, the logic of this is this. And there's plenty of, I'm gonna be honest, there's plenty of people who are gonna not like it anyways. But I'm asking, if you can see it, your right to suffer, you can also see your right to understand through suffering. And that's what I was doing with that book. If people must know, I'll talk about the book in maybe like a blog or a podcast. But I'm gonna be honest, this was a book about gay witchcraft, and it was completely half baked. The thoughts that were being expressed weren't fully thought through. It was entirely inappropriate from my point of view, many of the points that were brought up. And what I mean by that, I feel like we're far enough that we can get into this, is that this is about gay witchcraft, right? So there is some expectation that what we will be talking about is we are going to be talking about sex. We are grown-ups, we'll be talking about sex. But what I found is that, like, for example, of a half-baked idea, is that the writer would write in one paragraph for one chapter about the importance of us sticking together, about unity, about how we have very similar experiences and we can learn by working with other people and understanding them. And that's why him as a gay man, he believes that gay men should have their own practice and everyone should have their own practice where we're separate and we don't talk to each other and we don't engage. And I read that and I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean you spent the first half of this chapter saying that we should all commune together? Commune's a strong word, okay? But we should all talk together. We should all work together. And we have similarities just to then go, actually, never mind. I don't think we should engage with each other. I think, honestly, I think bisexual men and gay men have completely different experiences, and that's why they need their own space away from us. And I think lesbians should be away from us. And I think that trans people, they don't belong here. And I was almost taken aback at such offensively lack of thoughtfulness, a lack of thinking it through. I think that there's plenty of space to be offended from the exclusionary rhetoric, but I thought personally what I wanted to point out was like the complete lack of thinking and the offensiveness to sell a book for $20 where you contradict yourself in such an extremist form of view in like the same chapter in this same couple of pages. And that for me personally is like the power of discernment. There are stories that I personally do not enjoy, and there are artists that I personally do not enjoy. And what I try to do is I try to say, like, why do I not enjoy this? And a lot of the rhetoric that was in that book, I personally did not like. I did not enjoy. And I did not feel like it was fair for them or for me to write off this book with did not finish or I do not like it, case closed. Here's a one sentence snappy remark on Goodreads on why it's a bad book. I felt like I could take this book that I didn't like, I didn't appreciate, and I could say, okay, why did I not like the book? And if I say, well, it didn't have XYZ thing, it didn't talk about ABC thing, it didn't, involve one, two, three, then I can say, well, did it say it would talk about that? Did it say it would engage in subtopics? Would it actively market itself in the forms I'd expected it to? And if not, then I go, okay, well, in that case, that's what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for what this book is talking about. I'm looking for something else. And I'll be honest, this book is probably a really, really good book. If you are particularly looking for Wiccan-esque, Wiccan thematic or structured based theologies that are also hand to hand with also stealing cultures and being a gay exclusionary. Like, if that's what you're looking for, I think I have the perfect book for you. It's just going to have to cost you turning off your brain for 10 seconds. And continuing on my notion that you are allowed to suffer and you're allowed to say, hey, I don't enjoy this, right? It only figures that, in my own personal opinion, an artist who gave such poor rhetoric would only continue to write books and market it with fake AI, generative AI artwork. If I could not even trust this man to fully think through his own books that he was expressing for a profit, how do I not know that in addition to use generative AI for artwork, which I'm going to be honest, that's another topic, that he isn't doing AI artwork for his writing? And let's discuss that AI artwork when it comes to suffering. You are allowed to be a bad artist. You're allowed to trip and fall. You're allowed to suffer. You're allowed to not be good at things. You do not need to be perfect ever on anything, especially on the first try. This entire aspect of me saying you are allowed to suffer is something that particularly was borrowed and inspired by the work of the Gorilla Girls and their art of complaining. The Gorilla Girls are experts of complaining. They've effectively been doing it since 1985, says the book You Are an Artist by Sarah Green. Quote, a group of feminist art activists, the Guerrilla Girls have become increasingly aware that the art that they were seeing in galleries and museums in New York City wasn't necessarily the best of what was around. And after an ineffectual 1984 demonstration outside the Museum of Modern Art, protesting a survey exhibition that only included 13 women artists out of more than 150, they decided to try a different approach. Their posters name names and use information, statistics, and humor to expose gender bias, racism, and corruption within and outside of the art world. In bold black type, one of their first posters from 1985 clearly lists the names of galleries that are showing no more than 10% women artists, or none at all. A 1989 billboard asked, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Less than 5% of artists in the modern art section are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. Continuing this logic of artwork and points of view of how you can be bad and that's a good thing. In Craftivism, The Art of Craft and Activism by Betsy Greer, we see the essay Ugly on Purpose, Demystifying the Enemy by Kim Worker. They start with, quote, I run a project called Mighty Ugly, and it was deep roots that go all the way back to the summer when I was 10 years old. After I spent many years working in the crafts industry, encouraging people to take the risk of learning new skills, I often felt surprised and baffled by people's resistance to trying new things. But one evening, I found myself at a crafts party, feeling intimidated by, of all things, sewing a doll. Despite all my efforts to convince people it is worth it to risk failure to learn something new, I was utterly terrified by the fabric I held in my hands and my vision of a doll that I was certain I couldn't achieve in reality. Eventually, I decided to alleviate my fear by getting it wrong by intentionally making the doll ugly. My experience of this was so profound. A liberation from my own concern about being judged, from the pressure I put on myself to make things perfect, that I eventually made Mighty Ugly my main project. So as we can see, as compared to the gay book that I'm talking about, which I'm not naming because I feel like it deserves its own spot just to talk about. The art of complaining, the art of purposely getting bad, the art of suffering and not getting it right. You're entitled to that. You're entitled to have a negative point of view. You're entitled to be upset. There's this thing that I've seen within witchcraft spaces of people saying, I'm an empath. And they use the examples of being an empath as sort of this way to cart scale engaging with difficult conversations. And a lot of this came to head when I was working on my Abstract Heart Oracle deck, which, if you don't know, it's an Oracle deck and it's full of all these emotions. And this isn't a marketing thing, but it is relevant. And in it, there's happy emotions, but there's also anger, there's sad, there's disgust, there's fear. And there's these people who basically said, like, I need a tool. I need something to help me banish anger out of my life, to banish fear. And I'm gonna be honest, like, I wouldn't want to help you with that. I would never want to help you with that. It feels wrong. It feels morally wrong to say this is the thing that makes you who you are. This is the thing that gives you agency in your own life. Let's get rid of it. The right to be comfortable is a fascist ideal. It's one of the one interpretations, the tenets of fascism. It's people's belief of an inherent right to comfort and the removal of the ability of the right to be uncomfortable. This creates, as one person said in a video essay called Nothing is Punk Anymore, we are an epoch of mindless acceptance. Now, for the rest of that video, there were many points that I personally disagreed on. I disagreed with a lot of elements about it. And I had to continue for the rest of the video to fully understand what did I like, what did I not like, what could I agree, what could I not agree with. And the specific points of this is a thing that is like, it's human, it's humanity based, we all go through with it. But I don't personally like it, so it deserves to be gone. I don't agree with that. I'm thinking about my own personal anecdotal points of evidence where I felt angry. You know, I felt angry, and anger for me was a method to the madness that got me into self sovereignty. It got me into self advocacy and saying no. I realize now by being uncomfortable, I realize now by being angry that you didn't know this before, but these are my boundaries. These are my boundaries, and I'm going to actively say to you, no, you are not allowed past these boundaries without some form of consequence. So I hope that, and all the references, the books, the videos, I'm going to list them down below. I hope that if you do engage with that video, and if you do finish this Grimoire Ramble, you understand and you value, at least to some point, that I'm not saying you should, suffer eternally for no good reason except to, I guess, emasculate yourself and form this notion, this idea of, the melancholic artist who's almost romantically melancholic and consistently upset and frustrated with their lives. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that you do have the right to not be happy. You do have the right to be angry, to be frustrated, to voice what's, for lack of better words, pissing you off. You're allowed to do that. And in some cases, you're actually expected to. I've brought up Kafka and his writing of the Metamorphosis for a reason. So recently, I've had the displeasure of basically reading a review. And this was a review, I think, from Goodreads' #1 reviewer, or at least it was at the time, of Metamorphosis, which, if you don't know, Metamorphosis is a classic, right? Kafka, as a writer, he basically created an entire genre, an entire style of writing by himself, which, if you know, a lot of genres are pioneered by women. But he actually created this one, and his writing style is named literally after him. It's Katha-esque. And it's so him that the entire list of things that is described within that genre and the descriptions is just him. That's it. That's how monumental he was as a writer. And there's lots of different themes that, or should I say, experiences that he plays with. But if I had to boil it down to like one simple sentence that conveyed it, albeit incorrectly, it would be random person goes on an unending nightmare sequence of unreasonable and unexcusable suffering for the reason, for the point of view, for the sake of nothing. And that's it. It's almost like you are living this nightmare point of view. And in the Metamorphosis, I highly suggest if you haven't read it, you take the time to read it. The main person, right? If you don't like spoilers, skip this section. The main person basically says, I am the breadwinner for my family. I make the money for everyone, right? I support my entire family, which isn't just like my partner, like my sister, my like I support financially all of them, and I'm willing to put my life aside for them. And in fact, I have, and I will continue to do so. I pay off their debts. Trying to get them into school. But one day, the protagonist just wakes up and is a giant bug. And his entire family that he gave everything for basically just stops talking to him. They stop talking to him. They start feeding him less. They are disgusted by him. They are so confused and angry at him for existing, right? And he's suffering. He's suffering as this bug. And he's like, I don't get it. I don't know why you don't like me. I don't know why I turned into a bug. Can you please just help me? And if I remember correctly, there's like this section where like his sister either throws an apple in the room or throws an apple at him to almost convey like you are so disgusting that I'm not even willing to give you food in a respectful manner. Now I could have misremembered that, but the point is that the tone, the premise of the story is in of itself suffering to some extent. And some people have many different interpretations of the book, as it happens to classics, which is, is this an interpretation about disability and the way that society treats people who are disabled? Is this about, I don't know, the way that we expect women to consistently work, even if the protagonist isn't a woman? Is it the expectation that, we are supposed to serve with a smile even when facing horrors beyond our comprehension? Or maybe is this like a queer reading, since there were queer subtext and allegations with the writer? I'm not going to get into that. What I am going to get into is how that number one Goodreads writer that I spoke about is allegedly reading 365 books in 365 days in the same method that some people do, where they listen to audiobooks on 3 times speed while doing the dishes and going on a treadmill, and then starting a new book as soon as they finish the old book. So they're not actually reading it, they're not actually processing it at a sane, safe pace. And after, substantial research, allegedly according to them, they were like, I don't get it. There doesn't seem to be any sort of meaning or purpose or symbolism behind it, almost cluing in the reader of the review that the reviewer in question doesn't know what a metaphor is and is extremely perturbed from the point of view that somebody could write something where the intention is suffering. It is only coincidence, from some people's point of view, that that specific Goodreads reviewer, her favorite books are Twilight, Harry Potter, and Fantastical Beasts and Where to Find Them. There is a saying that I particularly think about. That there are 2 types of people. There are, one, people who know how to extrapolate data from what is missing. And that's the full quote. You either are someone who can extrapolate the missing information from what is said, or, and I think this harkens back to this notion that, um, art is supposed to comfort the uncomfortable and make uncomfortable the comfortable. And I think that that is almost a ridiculously simplified notion of the point of art, if there even is a point of art. When I specifically speak and think about, like, this is artwork in which there is suffering in it, right? And the suffering of the art is the main point. I personally, I go to horror, horror. Why do people like horror so much? Why do people like scary stories? Why do people like Silent Hill? Silent Hill is, for me, I think, one of the greatest examples of you are entitled to your suffering as a form of art. There are other video games that I personally believe implement suffering and horror to a expert point of view, whether it was, quote unquote, like a small indie, quote unquote, explanation, or if it was a major company. So I'm thinking about Silent Hill, I'm thinking about Bloodborne, I'm thinking about Bioshock, or Persona 5. These are all very, very popular games. These are definitely not, the $5 on sale indie game that probably equally, or if not better, has a more convincing and intellectually engaging story about suffering. And if there was ever a time for a content warning, this is it. So there's a YouTuber named TB Skyken, and I really enjoy his commentary. I will link down a series of his specific commentaries on Bloodborne.
Father Gascoigne is the first major boss of Bloodborne and the first major roadblock for most players, and in that way he makes a solid teacher for the game's mechanics. Master the flow of aggression and evasion of this fight and you're well equipped to figure out the rest. He's also the first confrontation with what the curse of the Old Blood looks like in practice. We find him obsessively carving into the corpse of an already dead Yharnam villager, and upon the player's approach he turns immediately to aggression, reasoning in his bloodlust that you'll be a monster sooner or later, so he might as well kill you now. Like many Bloodborne characters, Gascoigne blindfolds his eyes, which ties into the many eye and insight themes in the game, but beyond that he's relatively unremarkable, dressed in modest hunter fashion and for all intents and purposes quite normal, as it were. Which I think is the point, as demonstrated by his daughter's music box, the sound of which seems to force him to remember his humanity. Gascoigne is a normal man with a family, an ordinary person who might have had an ordinary life, except the violence and bloodlust and brutality of the hunt and the curse of the blood and the sins of the church and the horrors that he has seen transformed him and made him monstrous, to the point that even the love of his children can no longer call him back. That is the curse of the Old Blood. Subscribe here for shorts to see my detailed analysis of this character over on my main channel.
Bloodborne it's not a happy game. It's just not. If you engage with horror and you haven't heard about this game, I highly suggest you look into it. But the chances are you are not like me. You have already heard about it before someone introduced to you. Bloodborne is about many different things, and it uses the horror suffering of both men, women, and children on almost a cosmological scale to tell its stories, which inevitably, with the producer who makes these types of games, leads to many different interpretations for the meaning of these video games. There are, for example, many interpretations of Bloodborne as the painful and toxic effects of hostile masculinity and what it means for masculinity to control a society. Equally effective essays point to the meaning of what does it mean for religion and organized religion to control a society. And where some people would say, well, the curtains are blue, that's just because they're blue. It's important to note that the creators of Bloodborne are sociologists. They're basically experts in their field when it comes to understanding and conceptualizing the experience of other people and using it in convincing and intellectual storytelling. I personally am obviously a favor to the storytelling of Bloodborne through the point of view and lens of the queer AMAB or in some cases just queer experience where these beasts are being controlled because they're not who they are supposed to be. But I am also equally favorable to this video essay about Bloodborne and how it's about menstruation and specifically not just the horrors of menstruation, but the horrors of being a woman in this world and the different ways in which we enact violence upon women. If you are ever bored and you're like, I really want to get into this, I highly suggest a video essay. I highly suggest TB Skykin because he does these very in-depth stories and character basically dissections of what do these stories mean based on these universes where suffering is the norm. And it is almost our entitlement and defense of suffering that allows that when we see the exact same type of suffering but told in a different point of view with different characters and a different lens, we can recognize the injustice and the pain of today in the world that we live in. You know, without having to drudge yourself through the awful experience of reading a bad book and then saying, well, why didn't I like it? Bloodborne is not a kind and hospitable video game. And I think that now of all times, you may be wondering, why are we talking about a video game in defense of suffering and a ramble about artwork while we are a witch working on our grimoire? And to which I say, like, hold on. Bloodborne takes place in this world where for the majority of the gameplay, you are living and you are playing in a fantastically goth world. Incredibly goth, almost offensively goth, you know? The idea of these gothic cathedrals with the spikes and the pillars, and it's almost like the Bohemian Gothic Tarot by Baba Studios turned up even more on the gothic scale. And its stories, the story arc of the bosses and the world and the meanings are almost characterized of the violence that the writers probably could have seen in our world today. There is, for example, a character who, by all means, looks like an ordinary man. He is an ordinary man. He acts like an ordinary man. And yet he shows that not all who look like a beast and evil are, just like those who look like they're not, are always guaranteed to not be. Bioshock, on the other side of this, if Bloodborne was on this surface covered in blood, Bioshock is 7,000 fathoms deep into the ocean. Bioshock 1, 2, and 3, I enjoy all of them. You will notice that online in spaces, people do not enjoy the third one, and that's for a very specific point of view that I have contention with. The story of Bioshock, to put it mildly, I guess you could say is equally of horror as Bloodborne with suffering, but almost has an element of Shakespearean logic to it. And what I mean by that, the story, as explained to me, of Shakespeare, and by that I mean like the not just like the writer, but also like the way that he writes stories, is that he writes the right character but in the wrong story. Meaning that if you had taken the same character and you had put them in the wrong, like a completely different story, nothing bad would happen. nothing bad would happen. It is only out of coincidence and cause and effect that we find that these characters are in not the best settings, where their strengths are almost held against them as a weakness. So it is within the world of Bioshock where we find cunning critique of capitalism, consumerism, libertarian ideals, community overall, these ideals of what does it mean to protest, to fight for a revolution, and then lose yourself to the cause because of your own fanaticism. And also, interestingly enough, the artwork of the quote unquote splicers, as they're called in the game, splicers, because you are splicing the DNA of the people, are particularly inspired from trench warfare in real life. The actual world wars of the world, the consequences of it, and the way that people suffered in real life. And in some ways, they're pulling from this quote unquote ancient suffering, which is really contemporary suffering, to tell stories about how the consequences of it still live today. Bioshock takes place in a city called Rapture, at least for 1 and 2, and Rapture is no slice of heaven by any means. And I don't think it is intended to. You could not, or should I say, would not and should not, tell the same stories with the same ideals, only without the world of suffering that created it. The main character, or rather one of the main characters in the first game, Andrew Ryan, inspired by Anne Ryan and her Atlas Shrugged book, has the same ideals of charity is theft. One person is offering you food, and they have another hand in your pocket stealing from you. He is anti helping the poor. He is anti helping anyone but himself. It is, financially speaking, survival of the fittest, but without actually the fittest, because in many ways he tries to rig and control the system on his own behalf. Politically speaking, as a political witch, these stories, they have very real applications that take, in some cases, a lot of time to fully make the comparison and the contrasting point and say, oh, I'm experiencing horror in these video games, and these are the points, these are the methods that the rhetoric of these games are trying to tell me, and then these are the real world applications. But what about in other games such as Persona 5? Persona 5 includes some rather horrifying stories, but not told in a horrifying art style, which is very interesting. One of the main characters, On, basically has the unfortunate story of her best friend attempting to kill herself. In addition to that, she is also being basically sexually harassed by a faculty, by a teacher. And not just only any teacher, but a teacher that every student and almost every teacher is covering up for. Yusuke, an artist, is a struggling artist at best. He is being taken advantage of by his mentor, his teacher, who is also a teacher, to his mother that we later find out. He has a uncanny ability to somehow change his art style in such extreme prolific forms that is only later then found out, spoiler alert, that he steals from his students. He destitutes some by destroying their name, and in some cases, he's killed so that he could keep the profit. Is it killing if he prevents medical help? I say so. Persona 5 almost takes this shadow work witchcraft experience of tackling the injustices of the world, but in order to do that, you, the main character, have to suffer. You have to suffer through the terrible enduring story that is witnessing all the pains that you will then fight against. And also see in what ways this world defines itself by sticking to correctness and moralness and rightness of what is right and wrong, while attacking you, someone who is actively fighting to make the world a better place. If only there were certain realistic applications to that. If only there was a point in the world today in which we would say, morally, XYZ thing is wrong, unless corporation or said government does it, in which case then it is acceptable. And then it's not only acceptable, it's morally good, It's not bad murder, it's good murder. Almost like how sharks and dolphins commit the exact same things, except when sharks do it, they harness the power of teamwork to ravenously hunt and eat wild animals. Whereas dolphins, through the power of friendship and kindness, manage to find some local animals that are willing to be eaten. It's all a matter of perspective. Speaking from the point of view of a witch, what I mean to say from all of this is that I sincerely hope that what you do when you suffer is not for naught. I hope you take your suffering and I hope you create with it. I hope you allow yourself to be uncomfortable. I hope you allow yourself to be angry, to be frustrated, to be afraid, At no point are you a witch and you are expected to no longer feel fear. At no point are you expected to no longer feel frustration. In Restless Meditations, the guidebook for the Tarot Restless, made by Winslow Dumaine, he says, I believe people should explore their suffering. Understanding the causes of your pain is the key to growth. If you suffer and do not learn, you will have suffered for nothing. By suffering, I refer to the explicit experience of pain without casual context and before resolution. Understanding pain from a teleological standpoint reveals its vast potential. Pain is like uranium-235, at once loathsome and deadly. It is as well the source of boundless energy. How one copes with pain from the moment of their grief sets a course for not only their recovery, but their development as a human being. In this, we craft our futures in the way that we allow ourselves to live with pain. Misery is easy. We find comfort in grief and complacency in abusive situations, and thereby perpetuate a destructive cycle. Too often, suffering is dismissed as an obstacle to personal progress. Emotional turmoil is deemed immature and is therefore a prevailing and false notion that self-actualization requires the suppression of darker emotions. This, of course, only causes the pain to magnetize. Rest, we are told, rest and be positive. Get some exercise, drink more water, and ignore your pain. Pain, whether is denied, ignored, scoffed at, or suppressed by you or anyone else, is still valid. When you suffer, your whole world suffers. You see life through the lens of grief. Your suffering is not insignificant because you are not insignificant. Your suffering is meaningful, illuminating, and consequential and should be regarded as such. In creating this deck, I took my experiences with betrayal and heartbreak and retold them on the cosmic scale. This is a practice that I encourage for everyone that is in pain. You are hurting. Please use your pain. It is a hideous gift, and it is yours to master. Many cards in this deck were inspired by strong women in my life. Their struggles with abuse and violence helped me understand the abuse I suffered much better, and I cannot thank them enough. Without things ending, new growth would be impossible. I hope this deck provides a window to your pain, and with it, may you grow stronger. Life necessitates pain. Suffer well, Winslow Dumaine. Or, as I said earlier, The great 21st century philosopher Kesha Rose, love comes with pain. I don't know why. To put it shortly, my defense of suffering is this: you are alive. It is part of the process. And to try to escape suffering, to try to escape pain, is to try to escape humanity. And the only examples I can think of people who do this, and success to some degree, I am utmost disgusted with by people who are living in not just yachts, but uber yachts, who have the ability to end suffering. Legitimately, they have the ability to end world hunger, inequality of all forms, end homelessness, and they choose not to. In many ways, my in defense of suffering argument is less that you should suffer more, but more of that a lot of my artwork, a lot of my journey using grimoires, through tarot decks and oracle decks, making it, telling stories, enjoying life as it is, it came from me saying, I'm suffering, or this is not good, or I don't really like this gate book, and then saying, why? It's a very simplified grimoire illustration. Neptune, all I need is love. Reveal it in a dream. And to be honest, it comes from two different songs that I play back to back. It's The Pretty Reckless and Kesha. Only love can save me now, and only love can save us now. And when I think about suffering and horror and pain and all the different ways that people have used their suffering, from Bioshock and Bloodborne and Persona, but also Kafka. Also, some of the artwork that I haven't mentioned earlier that people had a very strong, uh, visceral experience with, right? Or all the different ways that people have decode and decode their feelings and their artwork. I think that when we meet our feelings face on, we may be uncomfortable, but it provides the opportunity for true and actual growth. Maybe you are uncomfortable, you know? Maybe you are uncomfortable and you are scared of trying new forms of artwork, in which case, remember Mighty Ugly, as mentioned in Craftivism, or buy the whole Craftivism book. There's an entire, sections of essays after essay after essay of people who used their suffering in art and they created purpose with it. In Don't Get Angry, Get Cross Stitched by Jamie Chalmers, the work of Noel Mason is discussed. In his work, Nothing Much Happened Today, for Eric and Dylan, it recreates CCC TV footage of the 1999 Columbine massacre. Quote, this piece delivers a double blow. The impact from the content of the image is followed by the impact when the viewer realizes that this took Mason 5 years to stitch this one piece. Blogger and craftivist Raina Felice writes, Noelle offered no explanation on her site as to why she did the piece, but is quite obviously a respectful acknowledgement of what was clearly a very difficult time for all directly involved, as well as the wider community. And in many ways, the act of making this piece is enough. A further explanation from the creator would limit the responses, and by saying nothing, Noelle allows her work to speak volumes. And with that, I leave you with the last part of the essay for you to think about and hopefully consider with your own suffering. Cross stitch might be one of the most powerful of all handicrafts. The gentle act of stitching combined with subjective reflection for both the creator and consumer puts this humble craft in a league of its own, making it an ideal tool for exploring and digesting the modern experience. It does not easily sit within the world of high art, where the disconnect between audience and production perpetuates prestige. Cross stitch is inherently populist and can be made and enjoyed by all. This is the root of its greatness. I cannot believe that I went this far into talking and then completely forgot to do the oracle reading. So I think we've gone far enough, and I definitely left you on a good note, but if you want the oracle reading, let's continue. I'm pulling a card from the Sasaburito Tarot on how can we use our suffering and use it for good, use it to create art, use it to tell good stories. I personally use this deck when I'm uncomfy and not doing good, so I hope that it provides. If you're going through suffering right now, it helps. And with that, I've pulled the Two of Pentacles, which are these two hands flowing up into the sky as these two pentacles are almost being surrounded and swarmed with flowers. For a card that is typically about balance, it's almost throwing your hands up in the air. So, for me, the personal method and message that I'm getting is that if you are currently suffering, if it's not going well for you, and obviously this is for, entertainment purposes only, something that you might want to consider is just saying, you know what? I I can get things out of suffering. That does not necessitate the need to suffer to begin with. I can suffer and say that wasn't necessary. And I can create and also say I've done my part, the rest is out of my hands. The advice is clear. You can hold alternative and opposing points of view and ideas in your head at the exact same time. It is entirely possible that suffering is part of the human experience, and your suffering was not necessary. Your suffering was gratuitous or unneeded. That's just something to consider. How can we turn our suffering into meaningful change is to seek balance, to find balance, and then balance the reality of this is a thing that happens with, but it doesn't need to happen. I hope that helps. Goodbye for now.